Well, good day. I'm Professor Philip Sloan, Professor Emeritus in the program in History and Philosophy of Science and the program of Liberal Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm speaking to you from the John J. Reilly Center at Notre Dame. I welcome our domestic and international audience to our webinar lecture and discussion with Dr. Fabrizio Bigotti of the Institut für Geschichte der Medizin of the University of Würzburg, and founder and director of the Center for the Study of Medicine and the Body in the Renaissance. The genesis of this lecture began with a small reading group in early modern medicine, science, and philosophy within the Notre Dame HPS program that read and discussed last fall Bigotti's 2019 book, Physiology of the Soul, Mind, Body, and Matter in the Galenic Tradition of the Late Renaissance, 1550 to 1630. As a result, we were eager to have a discussion with the author. With the marvels of Zoom, we now have been able to arrange this with a wider international audience. This lecture is also a contribution to the new Notre Dame Reilly Center Health, Humanities, and Society program. The lecture is also being simultaneously live streamed on YouTube via the website of the Center for the Study of Medicine and Body in the Renaissance. Fabrizio Bigotti is an intellectual historian with a specialization in the history of science, medicine, and technology. He's held positions as postdoctoral and research fellow at the Warburg Institute of London, University of Exeter, the Folger Institute of Washington, D.C., and the Edward Worth Library. He is currently senior research fellow at the Institut für Geschichte der Medizin at the University of Würzburg, working on 16th century medicine and anatomical method, in a project led by Michael Stolberg. He received his degrees from the University of Rome La Sapienza with his doctorate in history and philosophy and history of ideas in 2012 with a thesis on the influence of Galen's medicine and psychology on late Renaissance philosophy. His remarkable production of work since then has included studies in medieval and early modern conceptual history, the history of quantification, and reconstruction of scientific instruments. He's explored more broadly the role that classical and medieval philosophy has played in the development of early modern ideas of logic, method, theory of matter, taxonomy, anatomy, and physiology. In developing this research program, he's published monographs on such topics as the problem of form in natural philosophy from Aristotle to Linnaeus. His book on the physiology of soul I've mentioned, and he has in press a major co-authored study of Santorio Santori and the emergence of quantified medicine, corpuscularianism, technology, and experimentalism, 1614 to 1790, a work which promises for the first time in English to bring into clear focus the important contributions to medical theory, experimentation, and scientific methodology of this Paduan contemporary of Galileo. Bigotti has shown how this individual is one of the most formative of the early modern theoreticians of biomedical science. In addition, he's published numerous articles in leading journals in early modern mechanization, scientific instrumentation, corpuscular theory, Renaissance natural philosophy, Galenism, and Renaissance ethical theory. A separate introduction, I should note, could also be made concerning his work in musical theory with publications and recordings on the sacred music of the Renaissance, with special focus on the work of Gregorio Allegri. The topic of today's lecture, Galen on the Natural History of the Soul, will address several aspects of his work on Galenism and early modern philosophy. For so long in the English literature, at least, Galen has been confined to a classic form of early scholarship in the history of medicine, represented by such scholars as Ozai Temkin, Nicholas Manny, Charles O'Malley, and Vivian Nutten. In a long familiar narrative in the general history of science that we may all have been raised on, Galen was the authority overthrown by Vesalius, Harvey, and the medicine and anatomy based on the new mechanical philosophy. In the history of philosophy proper, Galen's name is missing even from the footnotes. What has been exciting about Bigotti's work is his bringing to light from his study of a wide array of original texts the way in which a new Greek Galen, based on works recovered only in the late 15th century directly from the Greek, has contributed not only to a revised view of his role in the history of medicine, but also to his understanding of his importance at the roots of modern philosophy, scientific methodology, the history of experimental philosophy and the development of corpuscularianism. His lecture today will give us some insight into these novel dimensions by an analysis of the importance of the discussions of little-known texts of Galen that entered in this Renaissance wave of translations for the early modern discussions of the soul-body relation and the origins of biomechanism. These positioned neo-Galenic discussions against the reigning Aristotelian scholasticism of the schools. The lecture will last approximately 45 minutes. After this, we'll have an open discussion. You can submit questions in the chat box or raised hand function. And with this, I'm pleased to turn this over to Fabrizio with his lecture entitled The Natural History of the Soul, Galenic Themes in Early Modern Philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. It is a wonderful opportunity to discuss Renaissance philosophy and medicine, and it is also an opportunity to meet with colleagues around Europe and overseas, over oceans, actually. So I hope to be able to share my screen. Okay. I hope you can see it. Please let me know if you can see it. Good. So I'll start with a quote, which is in Spanish, but I'll translate it immediately, so don't be scared. El muriendo, Galeno es cierto que descendió al infierno y vio por experiencia que el fuego material quemaba las ánimas y no la podía gastar ni consumir. Este médico tuvo noticia de la doctrina evangélica y no la recibió. When Galen died, it is certain that he descended into hell, and so by experience that the material fire burned souls and could not spend or consume them. This physician had knowledge of the evangelical doctrine and did not accept it. This quote comes from a marginal note on a passage discussing the immortality of the human soul, yet is not the self-righteous tirade of a theologian or the consolatory trope of a moral philosopher. It is the statement of a physician in a medical book. While its author, Juan Parte de San Juan, 1529-1588, remains an obscure figure, his work, Examen de Ingenios para las Ciencias, the examination of human wits by the sciences, became in the turn of a few years one of the most sought-after yet controversial European bestsellers. In his work, Huarte reclaimed for Galenic medicine the possibility to recognize, categorize, select, and eugenically control human innate abilities, thereby putting in the hands of the monarch a tool efficacious in maintaining social peace, all the while promoting the ingenuity and productivity of its citizens. In so doing, medicine was put front and center of the Renaissance political debate on sovereignty and the role of the monarchy, backing the latter's claims to absolute power with a scientific base. It is noteworthy that the overall architecture of the examen rests entirely on Galen's Quod animi mores, seeking to expand upon and to embolden its central tenet. As for Galen, so in Huarte, the human mind is an organic faculty, entendimiento potentia organica, nature like any other, and thus amenable to therapeutic intervention, restraint, and control. If so, then, how do we make sense of the initial quote? One way to interpret it is a preemptive argument against materialism and atheism to enable the book that might seem to lead to both of these stances to be received more favorably. Huarte is addressing his public, trying to reassure them of their fears. Interestingly, the same fears have remained constant over time and still reverberate with us today. A certain tradition in Western thought has in fact tried, unsuccessfully yet consistently, to exercise the possibility that human rationality could be just and natural if elaborated instinct. Modernity, in particular, has reframed the entire question of human nature in a way that made it impossible for us to recover animality as a part of the self. In a famous Galilean catchphrase, modernity had to remove the animal. rimosso l'animale, so as to get access to the world of mathematics and its eternal laws. The turn required a split between pure rationality and human instinct that was worsened by religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. As a consequence of this turn, the word soul came to mean little to nothing for many of us, especially when framed as part of psychology or the philosophy of mind. It is theologians and priests who talk of souls and eternal life. Modern philosophers debate the mind-body problem, tacitly reenacting the very split that was introduced in philosophy as a reaction to the embodied mind. In the mind-body problem, the former term is implicitly associated with a disembodied monad, independent of nature, society, and history, whereas the body is but a distant concern for the disembodied subject. To grasp how medicine impacted the early modern debate on human nature, now the notion of the soul was transformed as a result of the discovering of Galen in the 16th century, we ought to make ourselves familiar again with early modern medical terminology. In Nature of Philosophy, the matter is different in religion, the most long-lived conception of the soul was formulated by Aristotle, who conceived of the soul as the first and complete activity, entelecheia e prote, responsible for structuring the organs of the body and their functions, in a process that, from the informing of the conjoined matter of the seed and menstrual blood, leads to the formation of the embryo up to the completely shaped human being. The action of the soul is one with the tissues and organs it shapes, therefore making the body an organon, that is, an instrument of such an activity. Despite this might seem quite a spiritual process, it turns out to be the opposite of what it seems. As an organon of the soul, the mind too, with the possible exception of one single faculty in it that does not really pertain to the domain of a human being, is an organic function. To exemplify this conception, Aristotle claims that the soul is to the body what the capacity of seeing is to the eye. The two are different logically, but inseparable in substance. The entire body is thus shaped by one single act that programs and supervises all organic processes, no matter how differently articulated and spatially located in the body. Medicine thus becomes the central discipline through which we gain an insight into human and non-human nature alike, for nature itself is the life principle, physis in Greek. Furthermore, Aristotle believed that passions are rationalized instincts originating as pre-rational compulsions in the body. On the moral plane, we are animals capable of social life. Our characters are shaped by our social relations, which are in turn part of the political life of the city. Discourse is the mediator of social life, and thus an instrument of rationality which, if properly directed by logical method, can lead us to scientific knowledge. Thus, ethics can teach us how to handle our pre-moral inclinations so as to become better citizens, but passions cannot be suppressed. It is against this backdrop, however concise, that we have to evaluate the influence of Galen as a thinking doctor on the early modern philosophical debate. For it was Galen who, by emphasizing the more material and instinctual components of Aristotelian psychology and ethics, helped to shape much of the early modern libertinism and materialism, via Gassendi up to Montesquieu and Lessing. Three elements that contributed to Galen's long-lasting legacy are worth highlighting in detail. First, Galen denies that the body is presided over by a single soul or activity. Natural faculties are different in kind and cannot be located in a single anatomical place, as Aristotle contended. Our three-parted physiological system replaces Aristotelian and Stoic monism. Rationality resides in the brain, passions in the heart, instincts in the liver. As a consequence, the soul is scattered in multiple faculties, and the body becomes the seat of conflicting inclinations and compulsions. This conception is usually referred to as polycentric physiology or three-parted physiology. 2. Galen stresses the continuity between man and animal. The two differ in degree, not in kind. This is the reason why experiments conducted on chimpanzees, pigs, and sheep can be relied upon in drawing conclusions as to the anatomy of the human body. On the anatomy table, the animal is a replacement of the human being, both morally and physically. 3. Galen claims that passions are irrational and arise prior to any conscious evaluation as to their practical or moral implications. He points to children younger than 3 years old to show that moral inclinations are already shaped differently and are therefore innate. As it appears, the distinctive trait of Galen's nature of philosophy is that it anatomized the Aristotelian conception of the soul by reducing the form of the organic body to the form of its temperaments, so that limbs held to parts and purpose-directed activities turn into faculties, necessarily arising from the organic structure of the body. The continuity is rooted a priori in a new definition of form, or eidos, seen as the emergent property of mixtures and the substance of the soul, out of which natural faculties, passions, as well as moral inclinations and intellectual abilities arise. Such an approach is backed up a posteriori with some forms of experimentation. The polycentric thesis in physiology is confirmed experimentally by severing nerves, arteries, or brain cavities, thereby showing how the impairment of the organic structure hinders or abolishes a corresponding function in the body. The most spectacular example of this, Galen was a great showman and self-promoter, was the severing of the recurrent laryngeal nerve in pigs, an operation that made them suddenly unable to scream. Symptoms related to acute diseases constitute another set of experiences Galen draws from to show that changes in the organic composition of the body cause not just the abolition of a particular faculty, say the loss of memory, but they are responsible for a twist of character which the person is both unaware of and opposed to. Deliriums are taken as an exemplary case, but effects of phrenitis, poisonous herbs such as Helleborus, and high fever are equally taken into account. Variously re-elaborated, these topics crop up regularly in the Galenic corpus, but nowhere more so than in a little work called Quod animi mores, or in English, that the faculties or capacities of the soul follow the temperaments of the body. This is a little pamphlet that Galen wrote allegedly at the end of his career and that conveyed throughout the centuries a picture of his natural philosophy that is both consistent and original. The main thesis of the Quod animi mores is that our moral inclinations are predetermined by the physical constitution of our body in a manner that can either make us excel at intellectual tasks or prevent us from developing rational faculties at all. Two kinds of treatment are therefore suggested as a consequence of this. While severe moral training is recommended to those whose bodily constitution is healthy, different forms of medical treatment are suggested to the others, with state-controlled killing reserved to those whom physicians deem beyond medical therapy. It is not difficult to realize why such theses sat at odds with some of the moral arguments of medieval and early modern Christianity. They threatened the conclusions drawn by scholastic philosophers on the substantial unity of the human being and the possibility for individual afterlife, while mercilessly pointing to the fragility and caducity of humans before diseases and death. Worse still, the moral worldview that Galen drew from his medical presuppositions was that the origin of evil is not to be blamed on society or educational formation, but is inherent in the constitution of man. Humanity is thus unredeemable. Before our very eyes lies a world that is both beyond our control and blind to our moral requirements. This last point hinted directly at the core of the Protestant Catholic controversy on predestination, and especially the interpretation to be given to Matthew 22:14, wherein Jesus said, "Multi sunt vocati, pauci vero electi." Many are called, but few are chosen. It is also noteworthy that one of the central hopes of the Christian believer was not to be confounded, non confundar, with the unfaithful and the unelected ones, thereby missing the chance for the afterlife. For the last verse of the hymn Te Deum, "In te Domine speravi, non confundar in the eternum." O Lord, in thee I have trusted, let me never be confounded. It would be easy to characterize Galen's philosophy as committed to a form of biological determinism, but it would also be misleading. For what Galen was actually advocating for was a form of moral elitism, grounded on the selection, electio, of morally worthy individuals in view of their political role in society. Galen had exposed this conception in a work called De Moribus, which survives only in an Arabic abridged version rediscovered in the early 20th century, but the main outlines of his moral thought is highlighted in works such as De Placitis, Hippocratis and Platonis, and in the Fragmentum de Substantia Naturalium Facultatum, were sufficient to motivate his followers to pursue the same directions. Quarte, for one, chose to support this elitist approach with a quote from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, line 129, in which he says, To few great Jupiter imparts this grace, sed pauci equos amavit. Elect and select are thus key verbs to evaluate an important side of Galen's philosophical aftermath. Quarte's Examen de Ingenius being just one example out of many I shall focus on, to stress the continuity of these topics throughout the early modern period. Preliminarily, it should be noted that selection is a process that can be understood in two different yet complementary ways, the physical and the spiritual, which are linked by substantial analogies. On the physical plane, selective is the process that takes place in the body when the blood is purified from its impurities and fat components, so that the finest part of it, the spirit, is separated, selectus, and progressively refined, elixatus, in the heart and the brain to become the material substratum of mental faculties. The process is akin to distillation in alchemy, elixatio, when substances are separated and purified so that the essence, quinta essentia, elixir, is extracted out of the rough material. And so it is that the body itself becomes an alembic, homo alembicus, an image that was first developed by the Persian polymath Avicenna and then appropriated by physicians and alchemists, eventually popularized in the Renaissance by Gerhard Dorn as the image of the furnax anatomica. Much like the rough material that has undergone the distillation process, a person can be refined or spirited, or also, to borrow from the French, can be endowed with finesse and esprit, highlighting the ability to grasp the essence of something beyond its material and circumstantial manifestations. By the same token, spiritual selection operates by testing and putting to trial, thereby selecting the most valuable part. The Italian philosopher Antonio Persio, 1542-1612, a follower of Telesio, likens the purest ingenuity in man to the process of fire essay, saggio dell'oro, used in the Venetian mint to test the quality of metals. Similarly, Quarte's Examen de Ingenius is concerned with assaying, examinare, the value proper to each individual, a process that assigns a quality to them and therefore a specific position within the social hierarchy. As all criteria of value, this examen is both selective and hierarchically structured into positions that correspond to degrees of refinement and closeness to perfection, according to the Doctrina Perfectionum. For some are best suited at completing a certain task, and they are therefore perfecti. Some are less so, they are imperfecti. Others not at all, they are deficientes. To be considered valuable, talents ingenious, must be useful to society and therefore limited in number. They are arranged in pairs of opposites, the excellence at one task meaning the deficiency in the other, so that the two compensate each other according to a common measure, justitia, which in turn mirrors the table of temperaments, whereby opposite qualities, hot and cold, dry and moist, compensate each other to reach a perfect equilibrium. It is noteworthy that insofar as a talent is something that stands out, it is a form of excellence or preeminence, it necessarily corresponds to a specific imbalance. For instance, one can have the temperament of the brain hot and dry, and thus be quick at learning and doing maths, but will lack the complementary quality that is good memory or firmness of character, because this latter depends on the individuals possessing the opposite temperament, where moisture prevails. According to Huarte, only once a perfect balance between all qualities and capacities is realized, and this is the body of the sovereign, Philip II of Spain, to whom Huarte dedicates his book. The criterion that adjudicates ingenia is nature, natura facitabilem, which operates the selection of human talents by varying the degree of heat proper to each temperament. Inclinations and abilities are therefore innate and instinctual, as in animals, provided in a limited supply and for a specific purpose. They can be improved with training, but education will never produce anything new by itself, for it will then lack the very instruments on which operate. As a result, the ability to learn is predetermined by the nature of our intellect, which is material. To support his claim as to the materiality of the human mind, Huarte provides examples coming from his personal experience as a doctor in Baeza during the plague that overwhelmed the city in 1566, claiming that he witnessed people's twist of character and rise of new talents, as in the case of a servant suddenly capable of speaking Latin while under the effect of maniac accessions. This point is not a secondary one, for it crops up again and again in a variety of texts by physicians and philosophers dealing with Galen's Quod animi mores. For instance, the Italian natural philosopher Bernardino Telesio, 1509-1588, pointed to diseases and pain as the main proofs of the materiality of the soul. When affected by acute pain, in fact, our attention is completely absorbed by the phenomenon. The same happens with intense passions, whereby not only the mind but the pulse, the body temperature and alert are elicited and directed to one object only. An exemplary case is the loss of consciousness, the vacuum, whereby the subject is no longer aware of the bodily processes taking place in the organism, which is nevertheless striving after the restoration of the normal functions of the animal. These and other experiences that Telesio discusses in an early work titled That the Animal as a Whole is Governed by One Single Substance of the Soul against the Galen, Quod animal universum ab unica anime substantia gubernatur contra Galenum, written in 1565 but published only posthumously in 1590, show his debt to the Greek physician. According to Telesio, Galen was both wrong and right. He was wrong in claiming that there are different souls operating in different organs of the body, yet he was also right in claiming that the soul is material, which is spirit contained in the ventricles of the brain and operating through the nerves in the entire animal. The spirit is endowed with its own sensibility and ingenuity that allow it to select what preserves it and to avoid what hinders its conservation in each animal. This selectiveness starts with the capacity of plants and animals to pick their own food and becomes particularly apparent in their capacity of choosing their own partner and reproducing themselves without training, a didacton. Hence, the fundamental force to which all animals are subject to is their self-preservation, cura sui, which manifests itself into complementary compulsions, those toward food and sex. These are both irrepressible and uncontrollable compulsions. As a sentient animal, man too is subject to these very forces. Each individual seeks to preserve themselves by avoiding what is dangerous and seeking what is pleasurable. Yet such reactions are not conscious responses to external stimuli. They are rather instincts which we become aware of, consciousness being nothing but the manifestation to us of what has already taken place in the body, hence predetermining our reaction to the external world. In short, the mind is nothing but an amplified sense perception, with the consequence that the morals too are not shaped by rational decisions, but follow inclinations and abilities that have been predetermined for us at birth. As for Quartes or Intelesio, training can develop a latent ability without creating anything anew. As it appears, Talesio's conception of the rapport between consciousness and instinct follows the directions of the Renaissance debate on occult and manifest phenomena. In this debate, Talesio denies the occult and plays down the manifest, reducing both to different effects of the same cause, namely the motions of the material spirit. As a material substance, spiritus, is affected physically by two opposite forces, the expansion caused by heat and contraction caused by cold. All the properties we witness in nature are the result of these elemental forces, directed by the inner ingenuity of the spirit, which is an ingenium, spiritus ingenium, towards the achievement of particular goals. Remarkably, Talesio sees these forces at work in the human body and explains the reaction of the nerves to external stimuli and their conveying information to the brain as a series of circular movements of expansion and contraction. It is a process called antiperistasis, whereby the spirit increases or decreases in volume, causing reactions like the movement of muscles, pulse, passions, dull or keen intellect. Brain cavities are the main reservoir of spirits, where the spiritus reaches its maximum volume and, as such, it manifests to us as consciousness. Bodily processes are thus triggered by motions of expansion and contraction, that is, by changes in volume that are in turn a consequence of the intensity of heat. This vision of heat, which some interpreters have tried to trace back to the influence of Stoic philosophy, is in fact a cornerstone of medical thinking and is emphasized by Galen in particular. The reasons why heat was so important in medicine are not difficult to recount. On the one hand, heat was regarded as one of the fundamental properties distinguishing the dead from the alive, homeothermy being a phenomenon peculiar to living organisms. On the other hand, the majority of substances humans need to keep themselves alive require to be heated in order to be digestible or simply useful, cooking food and melting metals being two amongst a variety of possible instances. Another reason why heat is given a special place in medical literature comes from induction, for most natural transformations are exothermic in kind, that is to say, they produce heat. In this sense, temperature, temperamentum, temperatura, temperies, meant as the quantity of the active component in any mixture, natural as well as artificial, was central to ancient physics. Put together, these instances suggested a conception of the body, as we have already seen, as a kiln, whereby substances were purified and selected by separating them into vapors, fuliginous, humors, humores, and spirits, spiritus. The source of heat in the body was the heart, seen as the analogous to fire. These considerations help us introducing another author who dealt with Galen and actually wrote a manifesto of Galenic psychophysiology, the Italian physician Eustachio Rudio from Belluno, 1548-1612. To be sure, Rudio is a minor figure of late Renaissance Galenism who happened to work in Padua, the most important medical university in Europe at the time, where he had as a pupil none less than William Harvey. Unlike his contemporaries, however, Rudio does not intend to integrate Galen's teachings with discoveries made in anatomy by Vesalius, Fallopia, and Acquapendente. He wants to defend Galen's view on the soul against all its detractors. Rudio's work, published under the title of A Book on Soul, Liber de Anima, as you can see in the screen, is thus a manifesto of Galenic materialism, strengthened by borrowing selective aspects of Aristotle and Democritus' philosophies. According to Rudio, not only does the body as a whole need heat to keep itself alive, heat shapes every function of the body from the first formation in the embryo and the womb. Human generation is then likened to the generation of plants and worms, which according to Rudio are originally shaped by generatio ex putri, that is, out of the putrefaction of organic matter. The heat so generated is a mere quality, and it needs the heart to be constantly regenerated and supplied anew to all parts of the body, via spirits and the blood. Much as in Telesio, it produces changes in the volume of spirits, whose refinement produces in turn elevated mental capacity, eventually triggering the movements of the muscles, both voluntary and involuntary. Yet, unlike Telesio, Rudio denies the capacity of self-preservation to it. Ingenium is not present in matter since the beginning, but develops necessarily as a result of its multiple transformations. The system so developed by Rudio makes nature almost completely blind to human needs. It is noteworthy that Huarte, Telesio, and Rudio all admitted a kind of intelligence that is both immaterial and immortal. They call it variously anima ad eumissa, anima ecelitus de lapsa, or simply anima immortalis. They did so as a matter of faith, not as something can be argued by reason. Incidentally, this is the main cause why their works, with the exception of Rudio's, were censored by the Catholic Church and this is the main cause why their works, with the exception of Rudio's, were censored by the Catholic Church under the formula donec juxta regularum forma repurgentur, and thus placed in the index of prohibited books. Indeed, admitting a supernatural soul without being able to demonstrate its necessity, and in fact denying the possibility for the human mind even to conceive of such a necessity, was taken as an attempt at saving with verbal tricks and empty claims a thought that naturally lends itself to materialistic and atheistic conclusions. So, how did early modern physicians and philosophers put up with Galen's claims? An example of the kind of reaction Galen could provoke amongst his readers is exemplified by the French physician Nicolas de Nancel, 1510-1588, who plainly accused Galenists of atheism and libertinism, adding Galen's name to the list of libertini, acristoi, sadducei, credulones, and so forth. An eclectic Aristotelian like Francesco Piccolomini, 1523-1607, who taught natural and moral philosophy in Padua as a rival of Jacopo Zabarella, remarked that had Galen not provided his works with reliable experiences, his entire ars medica would have been useless, for he was blind to anything that transcended the physical domain of the body. Similarly, in his Temporis Partus Masculus, 1602, Francis Bacon criticized Galen for admitting that only nature could create the innate temperament and man could do nothing to alter it. In any case, by the mid of the 17th century, Galen had ceased to command obedience as a medical authority, although this was neither a complete collapse, as often portrayed, nor did it correspond to a loss of interest in his works. As said, the topic of Galen's Quod animi mores was deeply contentious and at odds with the requirements of the mechanical philosophy. The grounds on which mechanical philosophers, following the likes of Galileo and Descartes, rejected the vision promoted by Galen and his followers were also moral. The human subject could not be an object like any other in the world, for this would have compromised the moral autonomy required to divorce the past and thus build a new world by means of new technology. As Descartes has it in the initial lines that open Le Monde, this mechanical world is new because, while similar as to its phenomena to the real one, it opens up countless possibilities to human workmanship. Unlike the elitist project of the Renaissance Galenists, the reason underpinning the constitution of the new world is not restricted, at least not in principle, to the enlightened few, but is both universal and universally spread, le mieux partagé, says Descartes, much as common sense, bon sens, is amongst lay people. By the same token, reason is absolute and requires absolute command and the removal of any limit hindering its progress. And so it happened that by the mid of the 17th century, the body-centered natural worldview yielded to the machine-centered worldview, wherein everything is manifest and apparent insofar as reason, spreading everywhere its light, turns the complex into the simple, and qualities into quantities, so that the body is reduced to parts, matter to atoms, time to the uniform beating of the pendulum clock. However, the process that turned the body into a machine was complex, gradual, and far from a complete success. As to the life sciences, it took place first in anatomy, and then it was applied to physiology. Italy offered the ideal setting to this new development at the superseding of Galenism because the Italian humanist tradition allowed the rediscovery of Galen's anatomical texts, conducted directly from the Greek originals, a practice that then grew to full bloom in Padua, where Galen's teachings were pondered against their real bearings to human anatomy. Galen's Anatomicae Encheireses, Anatomici Administrationes, or anatomical procedures, show a body disrobed into pieces, whose relevance lies in their specific position, shape, and connection to each other, rather than in their function or utility. The natural theologian that in the Usupartium had celebrated the function and arrangement of the body as consistent with divine providence revealed himself to be a materialist to whom nature meant nothing more than a cunning assemblage of parts. Andreas Vesalius was the first to realize this, and his De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, never displays the human figure as a whole, which yields to a series of pieces from the larger to the smaller in a move that leads to the progressive miniaturization of the body. To classify them, Vesalius and the Paduan anatomists still rely on Galen's method, but with a view to select those aspects of it that best fits a new vision of the body. The body started being seen as an aggregate of parts, and the most important question physicians could ask about it was not how it mirrored the divine wisdom, but how parts work together in order to generate life. In this context, the very conception of the matter of the body changed. Borrowing from Galen's list of ill-composed parts, male compositiones, authors such as Girolamo Fabrici d'Acqua Pendente, Paolo Sarpi, and Santorio Santori classified parts according to three specially ordained criteria, that is, position, shape, number, situs, figura, numerus. The body thus ceases to be seen as a self-contained unit, namely as a place wherein it was possible to locate parts, and became the aggregate of specialized and quantified organic parts, all of them provided with their own magnitude, magnitudo, and outline, figura. This specialization of the parts in themselves was brought about by upholding the Galenic concept of form as temperament, that is to say, the inherent property of homogeneous bodies, humors, tissues, nerves, flesh. The body could now be conceived as a progression of forms, but of material forms, namely as an interlocked series of shapes, with the simplest contained in the more complex ones along the order of containing parts. With Santorio, this very process ushered into a new way of conceiving matter, as originally provided with quantity and shape, thereby morphing an anatomical method into a corpuscularian theory that underpins Santorio's invention of precision instruments and quantified experimentation in medicine. As Santorio contends, in fact, corpuscles come about by a process of information, whereby the form acts on a tridimensional prime matter by separating it into unities that are spatially located. In so doing, Santorio reasserted the main difference between atomism and corpuscularianism, which indeed rests on the role played by the forma, in natural generation. As Santorio clarifies in his work 15 Books of a Method to Avoid All Errors That Happened in Medicine, 1603, qualities are extracted out of prime matter by the intervention of a form that defines, definite, provides with borders. The undefined matter, so it is a definition of the undefined. Most notably, the form operates by confining the continuous units of prime matter into numerable self-contained units, numerus, therefore providing them with shape, or better still, with an outline, figura, and with position, situs. The very act of informing is hence simultaneously an act of dividing the undivided, that is to say, prime matter, into portions, particulae, or units, corpuscula, that are generated by following the directions imparted by a rational principle, forma. In this sense, the very concept of particle, particula, results from a procedure of division and composition akin to the anatomical one, that is the famous resolutio and compositio. Over the anatomy table, the knife in the hand of the anatomist acts as the form. It divides self-contained units, that is, limbs, organs, and apparatuses, into parts, which, depending on the level of analysis pursued, can be reduced further to specimens of smaller and smaller dimensions, from partes to particulae down to particulae minime. But Galen informs Santorio's approach on much a deeper level, for it allows him to reclaim the model of the clockwork, whereby the three-parted Galenic system of physiology is transformed into three independently moving parts. Start of the quote. The living body can be adequately compared to a clock and to a zither. To a clock, because even if the spring and the gear wheels are correctly arranged, it suffices that a single tooth of any wheel is broken, for which all the operations of the clock are interrupted. Analogously, if only one of the animal's natural or vital functions is interrupted, all of them are hindered or greatly affected. The living body is also compared to a zither, because if only one of the main strings is stretched more or less than necessary, the whole harmony is destroyed. End of quote. This peculiar term that Acquapendente and Santorio imparted to Galen's anatomy was possible because, in substance, the anatomical method was a logical method and represented a way of thinking well before being a way of cutting and handling specimens. As I try to show in this lecture, Galen's legacy could be interpreted differently by different authors. On the moral plane, it suggested an elitist and materialist approach to the mind and the distribution of talents amongst humans. In natural philosophy, it suggested to look at the transformations of matter as the source of ingenuity, both in human and non-human animals. Finally, on the strictly physical plane, his teaching provided the conceptual tools that opened up the possibility to think of matter as a substance of porous texture, although Galen himself had at times fiercely opposed this latter hypothesis. In a sense, however, Galen was never betrayed by his followers. Renaissance Galenists remained faithful to that anatomy of the soul that Galen himself considered as the most distinctive feature of his philosophy, and out of which, eventually, grew out all the questions I discussed thus far. Altogether, these questions underpin the necessity for us to come to terms with that corporeality of the body that modern philosophy has somewhat tried to make us forget, while reminding us that we think because we are alive rather than all the way around. In the light of this, and as a way of conclusion, we are left wondering whether, although refracted and multiplied through the kaleidoscope of its interpretation and developments, Galen's legacy impacted on early modernity less as a medical than as a philosophical authority. And I am confident that could we be allowed to pose such question to Galen himself, better still, if during one of his spectacular vivisections, he would calmly move away from the anatomy table, leave his instruments aside, and then point out to us that the question is ill posed, for he would say, the best physician is also a philosopher. Thank you.